Clara Whitmore pressed the letter against her chest so hard the paper cracked down the middle. The train pulled away. Steam rolled across the platform and disappeared. She did not move. She stood in the dead center of that wooden platform in Copper Bluff, Montana, with her one trunk and a name no one had come to claim. Her eyes searched every face. No brown hat. No Thomas Hargrove. Just two cowhands who looked through her like she was already gone. Then a voice behind her said her name. If this story touches your heart, subscribe to our channel and stay with Clara's journey until the very end. Drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I'd love to see how far this story travels. Miss Whitmore? Clara turned so fast she nearly lost her footing on the edge of the platform. A man stood 3 steps below her, hat in his hand, squinting against the sun. He was tall, broad through the shoulders. His shirt was faded and his boots were caked in dried mud. He wasn't wearing a brown hat. He wasn't Thomas Hargrove. "Who are you?" she said. "Caleb Turner." He didn't step closer. "I'm Thomas's neighbor. He asked me to come." Clara's fingers tightened around the letter. She looked past him, then behind her, then back again. "Where is he?" Caleb hesitated, just half a breath, but she caught it. "He took ill," he said. 3 days ago. Couldn't ride." Clara stared at him. "He couldn't ride," she repeated. "No, ma'am. But he could write a letter 2 months ago, promising to meet me on this platform, in a brown hat." Caleb said nothing. He put his hat back on slowly, the way men do when they know the next few words won't be easy. "I ain't here to make excuses for him, Miss Whitmore. I'm here because he asked me to make sure you didn't stand out here alone." "Well," Clara said quietly, "you're late for that too." She turned back toward the platform. Her trunk sat in the dust where the porter had dropped it. One latch was broken. She'd tied it shut with kitchen twine in St. Louis, and the twine had already started to fray. The station agent was leaning against the ticket window, watching her like she was a piece of unclaimed cargo. "Ma'am," Caleb said again, "I've got a wagon. I can take you out to his place if you want." "His place," Clara said. She almost laughed. "I came 2,000 miles to a man's place, and the man didn't even come." "I understand how that looks." "Do you?" Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "No, ma'am. I reckon I don't." That answer surprised her. She studied his face. He wasn't young, but he wasn't old. Somewhere in his 30s. His jaw was set tight, like a man used to keeping his mouth shut. There was a scar along the left side of his neck, just above the collar, thin and white. His eyes were steady, and he didn't look away when she looked straight at him. "What kind of ill?" she asked. "Fever. Maybe the water. Maybe something else." "Is he dying?" "No." "Then why didn't he send word?" Caleb shifted his weight. "He did. He sent me." Clara pressed her lips together hard. She could feel the heat climbing up the back of her neck, and it wasn't from the sun. It was from every pair of eyes on that platform. The 2 cowhands had moved closer. A woman in a blue bonnet had come out of the general store across the street and was standing with her arms folded, watching. Everyone was watching. Clara Whitmore, the mail-order bride nobody came for. "I don't need a wagon ride to a stranger's house," she said. "It ain't a stranger's house. It's the house of the man you came to marry." "A man who isn't here." "That's true." "And you're, what, his apology on horseback?" Caleb almost smiled. Not quite. Just the corner of his mouth, for half a second. "Something like that," he said. Clara looked down at the letter in her hand. She'd read it so many times on the train that the ink was smudged from her fingers. Thomas Hargrove's handwriting was careful, measured, the penmanship of a man trying to sound better than he was. I will be there in a brown hat. You will know me immediately. She folded the letter once, then again until it was a tight square in her palm. How far is his place? She asked. About 7 miles, hour by wagon. And when he recovers? That's between you and him, ma'am. She looked at the trunk, then at the wagon, then back at Caleb Turner, who had not moved one step closer without her permission. Fine, she said, but I'm not staying. Understood. He carried her trunk to the wagon without being asked, but he waited for her to climb up on her own. He didn't offer his hand. She noticed that. The road out of Copper Bluff was rutted and dry. Dust hung in the air behind them like smoke. Clara sat with her hands in her lap and her back straight and her jaw tight and said nothing for the first 2 miles. Caleb didn't try to fill the silence. That was the second thing she noticed about him. Most men couldn't stand silence from a woman. They filled it with nonsense. Weather talk, compliments, reassurances. Thomas's letters had been like that, full of promises about wildflowers and sunsets and how happy she'd be. Caleb Turner drove the wagon and let the quiet sit between them like a third passenger. After a while, Clara spoke. What do you do, Mr. Turner? I ranch, cattle mostly, some horses. Next to Thomas? Adjoining land, yes ma'am. His property's about 200 acres, mine's a bit more. And you're not married? It wasn't a question. She could tell by the cabin she could already see ahead. One chair on the porch, one set of boot prints in the yard. No, ma'am. Why not? Caleb kept his eyes on the road. Never found the right arrangement. Arrangement, Clara said. Is that what this is? For Thomas, I think it was. And for me? Caleb glanced at her, just once. Then he looked ahead again. I think you already know the answer to that, Miss Whitmore. They reached Thomas Hargrove's homestead just past noon. The cabin was small, cleaner than she expected, but empty in a way that had nothing to do with furniture. There were curtains on the windows, new, the fabric still stiff, and a table with 2 chairs and a vase with no flowers in it. Clara stood in the doorway and looked at everything he had prepared for her. He set this up, she said quietly. Last month, Caleb said from behind her. Bought the curtains in town, built the second chair. Clara touched the back of the empty chair. Where is he? His cabin's about a mile east. He's resting. You checked on him today? This morning. His fever's down, but he's weak. Clara's hand stayed on the chair. She didn't sit. You said this was a debt of honor, she said, still facing away from him. I did. What debt? Caleb paused. Thomas helped me through a bad winter 2 years back. Brought feed for my horses when I couldn't get to town. Man does that for you. You don't forget. So you're here out of obligation. I'm here because it's the right thing. Clara finally turned to face him. Mr. Turner, I want you to tell me something honestly. All right. Is Thomas Hargrove a good man? The silence lasted 4 full seconds. Clara counted. He's a complicated man, Caleb said. That's not what I asked. I know it ain't. Clara nodded slowly. Thank you. For what? For not lying to me. That's more than I've gotten in 2 months of letters. Caleb took a step back toward the door. There's food in the pantry, water in the barrel out back. I'll come by in the morning to check on things." "I don't need checking on." "I know you don't, but I told Thomas I would, and I keep my word." He put his hat on and walked to the wagon. Clara stood in that doorway and watched him go, and for the first time since she left St. Louis, she felt something she hadn't expected. Not safety, not comfort. Curiosity. The next morning, Caleb arrived at first light. Clara was already awake. She'd barely slept. The mattress smelled like new straw and lye soap, and every sound outside — coyotes, wind, a branch scraping the roof — had kept her rigid under the quilt with her eyes wide open. When she opened the door, Caleb was already stacking firewood against the side wall. "I didn't ask for that," she said. "No, ma'am, but you'll need it." "It's summer." "It's Montana. Summer don't last." She stood in the doorway with her arms crossed. "Did you see Thomas?" "Stopped by on my way. He's sitting up, eating broth." "Good. When can he come here?" Caleb set down the last log. He straightened and looked at her. "Maybe a few days." "A few days." "He's weak, Miss Whitmore." "He's been weak for 2 months, Mr. Turner. The weakness just takes different forms." Caleb wiped his hands on his trousers. He didn't argue with that. "You're angry," he said. "I'm humiliated," Clara corrected. "There's a difference." "Yes, ma'am, there is." He reached into the wagon bed and pulled out a burlap sack. "Brought some supplies: flour, salt, a bit of sugar, coffee." "I have money." "It ain't charity, it's—" "A debt of honor. Yes, you said that." Caleb set the sack on the porch step. "I'll be back tomorrow." "Mr. Turner." He stopped. "What did Thomas tell you about me?" Caleb turned slowly. "He said you were a shop clerk from St. Louis. Said you were 24. Said you wrote sensible letters." "Sensible," Clara repeated. "His word, not mine." "What would your word be?" Caleb studied her for a moment. The morning light was behind her, and she stood in that doorway like she owned the place already, even though she didn't own a single board of it. "Direct," he said. "My word would be direct." Clara almost smiled. She didn't, but she almost did. By the third day, Clara had organized the entire cabin. She'd washed every dish, swept every corner, scrubbed the table until the wood grain showed. She'd found Thomas's letters, copies he'd written to practice before sending the final versions, tucked into a tin box behind the stove. She read them all. They were rehearsed, every word measured, every sentiment calculated for maximum effect. "You will find in me a steady and devoted partner. I have land and livestock and a warm hearth waiting. A woman of your quality deserves better than St. Louis can offer." Clara set the letters down and pressed her palms flat on the table. He had written to her the way a man writes an advertisement. She was not a woman to Thomas Hargrove. She was an investment. When Caleb arrived that afternoon, she was sitting on the porch step with a tin box in her lap. "Found his drafts," she said. Caleb looked at the box. He didn't ask what was inside. "He's feeling better," Caleb said instead. "Wants to come day after tomorrow." Clara closed the lid. "Let him come." "You sure?" "I didn't ride 2,000 miles to sit on a porch, Mr. Turner." Caleb sat down on the edge of the wagon bed, facing her. For the first time, they were at the same height, eye to eye. "Can I say something?" he asked. "You're going to anyway." "You don't owe him anything, Miss Whitmore. Letters ain't a contract." "I know that." "I mean it. If you want to go back, I'll take you to the station myself." Clara looked at him, really looked at him. His hands were resting on his knees, scarred and calloused and steady. His face was weathered, but his eyes were clear. He wasn't trying to convince her of anything. He wasn't selling her a future. He was just telling her the truth. "Why do you care?" she asked. Caleb took his time answering. "Because I watched my mother wait for a man who never deserved her patience, and I swore I'd never stand by and watch that happen to someone else." Clara felt something shift in her chest. A small thing, like a latch turning. "I'm not your mother, Mr. Turner." "No, ma'am, you are not." He stood up, put his hat back on, and tipped it once. "Day after tomorrow," he said. "I'll bring Thomas myself." He climbed into the wagon and drove off, and Clara sat on that porch step with the tin box of practiced lies in her lap and the dust settling around her feet. And she thought about the difference between a man who writes pretty letters and a man who shows up with firewood before dawn. The morning Thomas was supposed to come, Clara woke early and did something she hadn't done since arriving. She put on her good dress, the blue one, the one she'd saved for the platform, the one she'd imagined wearing when Thomas Hargrove first saw her and knew she was real, not just a name at the bottom of a letter. She buttoned it to the throat and pinned her hair and stood in front of the small mirror nailed to the wall and looked at herself. 24 years old, thin, tired. 2,000 miles from anyone who knew her name. She looked like exactly what she was, a woman preparing to meet the man who hadn't come for her. She heard the wagon before she saw it. Caleb driving, Thomas beside him. Thomas Hargrove was taller than she'd imagined, thinner too. His face was pale from the fever, and his hands gripped his knees as the wagon bounced over the ruts. He was wearing a brown hat. Clara stood on the porch and watched them approach, and she did not go to meet him. She stayed exactly where she was and let him come to her. Thomas climbed down from the wagon slowly. He walked toward the porch and stopped at the bottom step. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "I'm Thomas Hargrove." "I know who you are," Clara said. "I want to apologize for—" "For what, exactly?" Thomas blinked. He glanced back at Caleb, who stayed in the wagon and said nothing. "For not being at the station," Thomas said. "I was ill." "You were ill," Clara said. "And before that?" "Before that? You had 2 months between your last letter and my arrival. 2 months to send word if you had doubts." Thomas straightened. "I didn't have doubts." "Then what did you have, Mr. Hargrove?" He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "I had concerns," he said, "about readiness." "Readiness," Clara said. "You mean money." The silence between them was sharp enough to cut. Thomas's jaw tightened. "A man has a right to be prepared. A woman has a right to be told the truth. I told you the truth in my letters." "You told me a version, Mr. Hargrove. I found your drafts." Thomas's face changed. The color that had been slowly returning drained out again. "You went through my things." "They were in the cabin you prepared for me, in a tin box behind the stove. You weren't hiding them very well." Thomas took one step up. "Those were private, and I was a private person before you put me on a public platform with no one to meet me." Caleb shifted in the wagon seat. Clara could feel him listening, but he didn't speak, didn't interfere. Thomas looked at her for a long time. Then he said something that told her everything she needed to know about the kind of man he was. "I think you're being unreasonable." Clara nodded. "I think," she said slowly, "that you wrote to a woman you'd never met, promised her a life you couldn't deliver, and when the moment came to stand on that platform and be honest, you chose a fever over the truth. I was ill. You were afraid." Thomas's mouth snapped shut. Clara stepped down off the porch. She stood one step above him, which made them eye to eye. "I came here in good faith, Mr. Hargrove. I left a job, a room, and the only city I've ever known because you wrote words that sounded like promises. So I'm going to ask you one question, and I need the truth." Thomas waited. "Do you actually want a wife? Or did you want the idea of one?" The wind picked up dust around their feet. Somewhere behind the cabin, a horse stamped and blew. Thomas Hargrove looked at Clara Whitmore, and for the first time, he had nothing rehearsed to say. "I don't know," he whispered. Clara nodded again. Slow. Steady. "Thank you," she said. "That's the first honest thing you've said to me." She turned and walked back inside the cabin and closed the door, and Thomas stood on the porch step with his practiced words and his brown hat and his 200 acres and absolutely nothing to offer the woman on the other side of that door. Caleb sat in the wagon and said nothing. After a while, Thomas walked back and climbed up. "Take me home," he said. Caleb picked up the reins. They rode in silence for a quarter mile before Thomas spoke again. "She's not what I expected." Caleb kept his eyes on the road. "No," he said quietly. "She ain't." Caleb came back the next morning, like nothing had happened. Clara heard the wagon before sunrise. She was already awake, sitting at the table with cold coffee and the tin box of Thomas's draft letters still open in front of her. She hadn't slept. Not because of the coyotes this time. Because of the look on Thomas Hargrove's face when he said, "I don't know." She'd asked a man if he wanted her, and he couldn't answer. She closed the tin box and pushed it to the far end of the table when Caleb's boots hit the porch. He knocked twice. Waited. She opened the door. "Morning," he said. "You don't have to keep coming here, Mr. Turner." "I know." "Then why are you here?" Caleb held up a paper sack. "Eggs. My hens are laying more than I can eat." "That's not an answer." "It's the best one I got at this hour, ma'am." Clara took the sack. Their fingers didn't touch, but they came close enough that she noticed. She stepped back and held the door open wider than she needed to. He came inside. It was the first time he'd been in the cabin since the day he brought her here. He stood near the door and didn't move further. His eyes went to the tin box on the table. "You kept those," he said. "Evidence," Clara said. Caleb almost smiled. "Of what?" "That I wasn't imagining things. That the man who wrote those letters was performing a role." "Most people perform in letters." "Did you? When you wrote to anyone?" "I don't write letters." "Ever?" "Never had anyone to write to." Clara cracked an egg into the skillet she'd heated on the stove. The sizzle filled the silence. "Sit down, Mr. Turner." He hesitated. "I'm cooking your eggs. The least you can do is sit and eat one." He sat. He placed his hat on his knee and folded his hands on the table and looked at her the way a man looks at something he doesn't understand but respects. "Thomas came to see me last night," Caleb said. Clara's hands stilled over the skillet, just for a second. Then she kept cooking. "And?" "He's angry. At me. At everything. You, the situation, himself mostly. But he ain't the kind of man who knows how to be angry at himself, so it comes out sideways." "What did he say?" Caleb was quiet long enough that Clara turned around. "What did he say, Mr. Turner?" "He said you went through his personal belongings. He said you had no right." "I had every right. He invited me into that cabin." "I know that." "Then what's the problem?" "The problem is, he's talking about it in town." Clara set the skillet down hard. "Talking about what in town?" "About you being difficult, ungrateful." He told Bill Carver at the feed store that he sent for a bride and got a lawyer. Clara's jaw tightened so hard her teeth ached. A lawyer. His words. And what did Bill Carver say? Bill Carver laughed. Clara pressed both hands flat on the edge of the stove. The iron was warm, but not burning. She felt the heat spread through her palms, and she held it there because she needed something solid to push against. So the town thinks I'm the problem, she said. The town thinks what Thomas tells them. And what do you think? Caleb looked at her steady. I think a man who can't answer a simple question has no business blaming the woman who asked it. Clara released the stove. She slid an egg onto a plate and set it in front of him and sat down across the table. Eat, she said. He ate. They sat in silence for 3 full minutes, and it was the most peaceful Clara had felt since leaving Missouri. Mr. Turner. Ma'am? I need to go into town today. Caleb set down his fork. Why? Because if Thomas Hargrove is going to tell people his version of this story, they're going to hear mine too. That's a fight you might not win. I don't need to win. I need to be heard. Caleb pushed his plate forward. He looked at her for a long time with those steady, unreadable eyes. I'll drive you, he said. I can walk. It's 7 miles. I've walked further. Not in this heat you haven't. Clara crossed her arms. Fine, but I'm sitting in the back. Suit yourself. She didn't sit in the back. She sat next to him on the bench. She told herself it was because the wagon bed was full of hay dust. But that wasn't the reason, and she knew it. The ride into Copper Bluff took just under an hour. Neither of them spoke for the first half. Then Clara broke. What did you do in the war, Mr. Turner? Caleb's hands tightened on the reins. Barely visible, but she saw it. Cavalry, he said. Union side. How long? 3 years. Is that where the scar came from? His left hand released the rein and touched his neck, just briefly, like a man checking if a wound is still there. Spotsylvania, he said. Mini ball. Missed the artery by about an inch. An inch? Surgeon said I was lucky. Didn't feel lucky at the time. Does it ever? Caleb looked at her. Does what ever? Luck. Does it ever feel like luck when it's happening? He didn't answer, but something changed in his face. A softening around the eyes, like a door cracked open. No, he said finally. It usually just feels like surviving. Clara nodded. That's what yesterday felt like. Standing on that porch with Thomas. Surviving. You did more than survive, Miss Whitmore. You stood your ground. I stood my ground because I had nowhere else to stand. That still counts. Copper Bluff wasn't much of a town. One main street, a general store, a feed supply, a saloon, a church at the far end, and a post office that doubled as the land registry. Maybe 200 people on a busy day. Today was busy. Clara noticed the eyes before she noticed anything else. The woman in the blue bonnet from the first day was standing outside the general store again, arms folded, mouth tight. 2 older men on the bench outside the saloon stopped talking mid-sentence. A boy, carrying a bucket of water, slowed down to stare. Caleb pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the general store. You sure about this? He said quietly. No, Clara said, but I'm doing it anyway. She climbed down before he could offer help and walked straight through the front door. The general store smelled like tobacco and vinegar and old wood. Behind the counter stood a man she hadn't met, stocky, red-faced, wiping his hands on a canvas apron. Bill Carver. Had to be. 3 women were clustered near the fabric bolts, and they stopped talking the instant Clara walked in. "Good morning," Clara said. Nobody answered. She walked to the counter. "I'd like a pound of flour, a tin of coffee, and a bar of soap, please." Bill Carver looked at her like she'd asked for the deed to his store. "You're the Hargrove woman," he said. "I'm Clara Whitmore, Thomas's bride." "I'm no one's bride, Mr. Carver. I'm a customer. Flour, coffee, and soap." He didn't move. "Thomas said you've been causing trouble out at his place." "Thomas said a lot of things, most of them in letters he practiced 3 times before sending. Are you going to sell me soap, or should I go somewhere else?" One of the women near the fabric bolts made a sound, half gasp, half laugh. Clara didn't turn to see which one. Bill Carver's face went redder. He reached under the counter and set out the flour, then the coffee, then slammed the soap bar down harder than necessary. 40 cents, he said. Clara opened her glove and pulled out 2 quarters. She placed them on the counter, picked up her supplies, and turned to leave. "A woman traveling alone to meet a man she's never seen," Bill Carver said behind her. "And now she's staying in his cabin without him. Folks have a word for that." Clara stopped. The store went silent. Even the dust motes seemed to freeze. She turned around slowly. "Say it," she said. Bill Carver's mouth opened. "Say the word, Mr. Carver. Say it to my face so I can hear it clearly." He didn't say it. "That's what I thought," Clara said. She walked out of that store with her back straight and her chin up, and her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped the soap. Caleb was waiting by the wagon. He saw her face and didn't ask. "Take me back," she said. "Yes, ma'am." She climbed up onto the bench and sat rigid as a fence post and did not cry. She did not cry on the road out of town. She did not cry when they passed the creek where the cottonwoods leaned together like old gossips. She did not cry when the cabin came into view. She cried when she was inside, alone, with the door shut and the soap still in her hand. She cried for exactly 4 minutes. Then she washed her face, put the supplies away, and started kneading dough. Caleb didn't come in. He stacked wood. He checked the water barrel. He repaired a loose board on the porch step. He did everything a man does when he knows a woman needs space but can't bring himself to leave. When she finally opened the door, he was sitting on the porch step with his hat beside him. "I heard what he said," Caleb told her. "I handled it." "You did more than handle it. You shut him down cold." "It doesn't matter. They'll still talk." "Let them talk." "Easy for you to say. You're not the one they're calling." She stopped. "I know what they're calling you," Caleb said quietly. "And every one of them is wrong." Clara sat down on the step beside him, not touching, close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off his shoulder. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. "And don't say debt of honor. I want the real reason." Caleb picked up a splinter of wood from the step and turned it between his fingers. He was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. "Because you remind me of someone who deserved better and didn't get it," he said. "Your mother?" "Yes." "What happened to her?" "She married a man who made promises he couldn't keep. Spent 20 years waiting for him to become the man he described in his courtship letters. He never did. She died waiting." Clara felt the air leave her body. "How old were you?" 14. "And your father?" "Drank himself dead 2 years later." Clara pressed her hands together in her lap. "So when you look at me, you see her?" "No." Caleb turned his head and looked at her directly. "When I look at you, I see someone who ain't going to wait 20 years. That's the difference." Clara held his gaze. 4 seconds. 5. "I'm not going to wait 20 days, she said. "No, ma'am. I don't believe you will." Something passed between them. Not a spark, not electricity. Something quieter. Something like recognition. Two people who understood loss, looking at each other and seeing someone who might understand theirs. Clara broke the gaze first. "Thomas will come back," she said. "Probably. He's the kind of man who can't stand being told he was wrong. He'll want to prove something. To you. To himself. To the town." "What do I do?" Caleb set the splinter down. "You do whatever you decide to do. I ain't going to tell you how to handle a man you came here to marry." "I didn't come here to marry him. I came here to marry the man in the letters. That man doesn't exist." "No, he doesn't." "So what exists?" Caleb was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "This porch, that garden bed, the flower in your pantry, a roof that needs patching before winter. Things that are real." "And you," Clara said. Caleb went still. "You exist, Mr. Turner." He picked up his hat, put it on, stood up. "I'll be back in the morning." "You always are." He walked to the wagon, stopped, turned back. "Miss Whitmore." "Yes?" "That dress, the blue one you wore for Thomas." Clara looked down. She was still wearing it. She'd forgotten. "Don't waste it on a man who doesn't notice," Caleb said. Then he climbed into the wagon and drove away. And Clara stood on that porch in her blue dress and pressed her hand against her ribs, where something was beating too hard and too fast. 2 days passed. Caleb came each morning. They developed a rhythm without discussing it. He brought supplies. She cooked breakfast. He repaired things around the property. She organized, cleaned, found purpose in labor. They talked while working, and the talking became easier, and the silences between words became comfortable. And Clara began to notice things. The way he always removed his hat when he stepped inside. The way he waited for her to speak first. The way he never stood between her and the door. Small things. The kind of things a woman notices when she's been paying attention to the wrong man for too long, and suddenly sees the right one standing in plain sight. On the 5th morning, Clara was hauling water from the barrel when she heard hoofbeats. Not wagon wheels. Hoofbeats. Fast. She set the bucket down and straightened. Thomas Hargrove rode up on a bay mare, and he wasn't alone. A man in a black coat sat behind him on a second horse, thin, sharp-eyed, carrying a leather folder. Thomas dismounted and walked toward the cabin with his chest puffed and his jaw set. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "we need to talk." "So talk." "This is Mr. Aldrich. He's the county land assessor." Clara's stomach dropped. She looked at the man in the black coat. He didn't tip his hat. "Mr. Hargrove," Clara said slowly, "what is this?" "This cabin sits on my land," Thomas said. "My name is on the deed. I built it. I furnished it. And I'm within my rights to determine who occupies it." "You invited me to occupy it." "That invitation was conditional on a marriage arrangement that you have made clear you do not intend to honor." Clara felt her blood go cold. Not with fear, with fury. "You're evicting me," she said. "I'm reclaiming my property." "Your property." Clara's voice was low and steady and dangerous. "I am standing in a cabin you built to lure a woman across the country. You stocked it with flour and curtains and a second chair because you needed someone to sit in it. And now that I've seen through your performance, you want the chair back." Thomas's face flushed. "I have every legal right." "Legal?" Clara laughed. One short, sharp sound. "You want to talk about legal, Mr. Hargrove? You wrote letters constituting a verbal contract of marriage. You provided passage arrangements. You specified a date, a location, and a commitment. In any court in this territory, that would be considered a binding arrangement. Mr. Aldrich shifted on his horse. Ma'am, I'm just here to... You're here because Thomas Hargrove dragged you into a fight he started because a woman asked him an honest question and he didn't like the answer. Thomas stepped forward. You have 3 days to vacate. Or what? Or I'll have the sheriff remove you. Clara didn't flinch. She didn't step back. She stood on that porch like it was hers and looked Thomas Hargrove dead in the eyes. Then get the sheriff, she said. And while you're at it, bring the whole town. Let them see what kind of man evicts a woman he invited into his home because she had the nerve to ask if he really wanted her there. Thomas's hand clenched at his side. He looked at Aldrich. Aldrich looked at the ground. 3 days, Thomas said again, but his voice cracked on the second word. He mounted his horse. Aldrich followed. They rode off without looking back. Clara's knees gave out the moment they disappeared over the ridge. She sat down hard on the porch step and pressed both hands against her mouth and breathed through her fingers until the shaking stopped. When Caleb arrived an hour later, she was standing at the stove making coffee like nothing had happened. He knew immediately. What's wrong? He said from the doorway. Thomas came. And? He brought the land assessor. He's giving me 3 days to leave. Caleb's expression didn't change, but his hands curled into fists at his sides, and his knuckles went white. He can't do that, Caleb said. He can. It's his land. It's his land, but it ain't right. Right doesn't matter much when your name isn't on a deed, Mr. Turner. Caleb stepped inside. He stood across the table from her. His voice was controlled but tight, like a rope about to snap. Where will you go? Clara poured the coffee. Her hand was steady. I have $3. That won't get you past Billings. I know. Clara. She looked up. It was the first time he'd used her given name. Stay on my land, he said. What? I've got a spare room in the main house. It ain't much, but it's on my property, with my name on the deed, and Thomas Hargrove has no authority over a single board of it. Clara set the coffee pot down. Do you understand what people will say? I don't care what people say. You should. This town already thinks I'm... This town doesn't know you. I do. The words hung between them, heavy and plain and true. Clara's eyes burned, but she didn't blink. Why? She whispered. Why do you keep doing this? Caleb pulled out the chair and sat down. He folded his hands on the table and looked at her the way he always did. Steady, clear, unhurried. Because when I was 14 years old, my mother stood in a doorway just like this one and asked my father for the truth. And he lied to her face. And no one in that whole town stood up and said it was wrong. Not one person. He paused. I'm standing up now. Clara pressed her hand against her mouth. She held it there for 5 seconds. Then she lowered it. I'll take the spare room, she said. And I'll pay rent. You don't have to. I'll pay rent, Mr. Turner, or I won't go. Caleb nodded once. Fair enough. And Caleb, he looked at her. Thank you for saying my name. He picked up his hat, turned it once in his hands. It's a good name, he said. Someone ought to say it. Clara packed her trunk that afternoon. She folded the blue dress carefully and placed it at the bottom. She left the tin box of Thomas's letters on the table, lid open, right where he'd find them. Let him read his own lies back to himself. Caleb loaded the trunk into the wagon at dusk. Clara stepped off the porch of Thomas Hargrove's cabin for the last time and did not look back. She climbed onto the wagon bench beside Caleb Turner and sat close enough that their shoulders almost touched. And when the cabin disappeared behind the ridge, she let out a breath she'd been holding for 6 days. Caleb, she said. Ma'am? Stop calling me ma'am." He glanced at her. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but closer than before. "Yes, Clara," he said. And the wagon rolled west toward his land, and the dust settled behind them, and neither one of them said another word. Because some things don't need words, and they both knew it. Clara had been living in Caleb's spare room for 11 days when the first stone came through the window. She was at the kitchen table, mending a tear in her work dress, the gray one, not the blue, when the glass shattered inward and something hard skidded across the floor and stopped against the leg of the stove. She didn't scream. She set the needle down, pushed her chair back, and picked up the stone. It was smooth, round, the kind boys skip across creeks. Tied to it with twine was a scrap of paper. She unfolded it. One word. Harlot. Caleb came through the back door so fast he hit his shoulder on the frame. He had an axe in his hand and sawdust in his hair, and his eyes were already searching the room before he'd finished crossing it. "You hurt?" he said. "No." He saw the broken glass, then the stone, then the paper in her hand. "Let me see it," he said. Clara held it out. His face didn't change when he read the word, but his grip on the axe handle tightened until the wood creaked. "I'll find out who did this," he said. "It doesn't matter who." "It matters to me." "Caleb," she said his name firmly. "It's a word on a piece of paper. It can't hurt me more than what's already been said." He set the axe against the wall and stood there, breathing hard through his nose. His jaw worked like he was chewing on something he wanted to spit out. "This is because of Thomas," he said. "This is because of a town that would rather blame a woman than question a man." Caleb turned and looked at the broken window. The evening air was coming through it warm and smelling of dry grass. He stood still for a long time. Then he did something that surprised her. He pulled off his work gloves, walked to the pantry, and came back with a piece of oiled canvas and a hammer and nails. He covered the window in 3 minutes without saying another word. When he was done, he sat across from her at the table. "This is going to get worse," he said. "I know." Thomas has been talking. Every day. At the saloon, the feed store, the church steps. He's telling people you came here under false pretenses. That you refused to honor your agreement. That you're living with me to spite him. "Living with you?" Clara repeated. "That's the word he's using. Living with." Clara folded the paper with the ugly word on it and tucked it into her apron pocket. "What word are you using?" Caleb met her eyes. "Sheltering, protecting, doing what's right." "And the town?" "The town hears what it wants to hear." Clara stood and walked to the stove and poured coffee she didn't want, just to have something to do with her hands. "I should leave. Go to Billings. Find work." "You could. But you'd be running. And you ain't a runner, Clara." She set the cup down without drinking. "How do you know what I am? You've known me less than 2 weeks." "I've known you long enough to watch you stare down Thomas Hargrove, shut Bill Carver's mouth, and sleep in a stranger's house without locking your door. I don't need 2 years to know what kind of woman does that." Clara felt the sting behind her eyes and blinked it back hard. "I locked the door," she said quietly. Caleb's eyebrows rose. "The first 3 nights, I locked it. And after that?" "After that, I've decided you were the kind of man who'd knock." Something moved across Caleb's face, something raw and quick and painful. He looked away first, the first time she'd ever seen him break a gaze before she did. "I'll always knock," he said. Clara carried those words to bed that night and held them like a lantern in a dark room. The next morning brought worse. Clara walked into town alone. Caleb had argued against it, but she told him plainly that she would not be a woman who hid behind a man's property line, and he respected that, even though every muscle in his body wanted to follow her. She needed thread, simple as that. Thread and 2 buttons for the dress she was mending. The walk took an hour and a half. By the time she reached the main street, her boots were dusty and her forehead was damp, and she was thirsty enough to drink from a horse trough. She walked into the general store. Bill Carver was behind the counter. 2 women she didn't know were near the back. A man in a preacher's collar was examining a tin of boot polish near the window. Every head turned. "Thread and 2 buttons," Clara said. "White." Bill Carver folded his arms. "Can't help you." "Excuse me?" "I said I can't help you, Miss Whitmore." "Can't or won't?" "Take it however you like." Clara steadied herself. "Mr. Carver, I am a paying customer. I have money. I want to buy thread." "And I have the right to refuse service to anyone I choose." The 2 women near the back exchanged glances. The preacher set down the boot polish and watched. "On what grounds?" Clara asked. "On the grounds that your presence in this town is disruptive." "My presence, not Thomas Hargrove's lies. My presence." "Thomas is a member of this community, has been for 8 years. You've been here 2 weeks and already caused more trouble than—" "I caused trouble?" Clara's voice rose. She let it. "I sat on a platform for 3 hours, waiting for a man who didn't come. I was stared at, whispered about, and judged before I spoke a single word. I've been called names. I've had a rock thrown through my window. And now you're telling me I'm the disruptive one?" The preacher stepped forward. "Ma'am, perhaps this isn't the place. Reverend, with all due respect, this is exactly the place. Because this is the only store in town, and if I can't buy thread here, I can't buy it anywhere. There are ways to resolve disputes quietly. I tried quietly. Quietly got me a stone through a window." The store fell silent. Bill Carver unfolded his arms. He looked uncomfortable. The 2 women near the back looked at each other, and one of them, the younger one, couldn't have been more than 30, stepped forward. "I've got extra thread," she said. "White. You can have it." Every eye in the store turned to her. "I'm Ruth Dawson," the woman said. "My husband runs the livery, and I've got 2 spools at home you're welcome to." Bill Carver's face darkened. "Ruth, I'm offering a woman thread, Bill, not treason." Clara looked at Ruth Dawson and felt something crack open in her chest. Not pain this time. Something warmer. "Thank you," Clara said. "I'll pay you for it." "You'll do no such thing. Come by the livery. I'll have it for you." Clara nodded once, turned, and walked out of the general store for the last time. Behind her, she heard Bill Carver say something under his breath, and Ruth Dawson answer loud enough for everyone to hear. "Shame on you, Bill." Clara walked to the livery with her back straight and her hands still, and her heart hammering so loud she could hear it in her ears. Ruth Dawson met her at the stable door 10 minutes later, with 2 spools of white thread, 3 buttons, and a jar of blackberry preserves. "You don't have to do this," Clara said. "I know I don't. That's why I'm doing it." "They'll talk about you now, too," Ruth shrugged. "They've been talking about me since I married a liveryman instead of the banker's son. I'm used to it." Clara almost smiled. Almost. "How bad is it?" Ruth asked. "What Thomas is saying." "Bad enough that someone threw a rock." Ruth's expression hardened. "Do you know who?" "Does it matter?" "It matters because I've got 3 boys, and if one of them did it, I'll tan his hide till he can't sit for a week." Clara laughed. A real laugh. The first one in Montana. Ruth grinned. There she is. I knew there was a laugh in there somewhere. They stood outside the livery and talked for 20 minutes. Ruth told her about the town, who to trust, who to avoid, who talked big but meant nothing, and who said nothing but meant everything. Caleb Turner, Ruth said carefully. He's a good man. I know. The town doesn't know what to make of you two. There's nothing to make of us. Ruth gave her a look. Clara, I've been married 11 years. I know what something looks like, even when the people in it don't know it yet. Clara picked up the thread and the preserves and thanked her and walked back toward Caleb's land without answering that, because she couldn't answer it honestly, without saying something she wasn't ready to say. She was halfway home when she saw the dust cloud, coming from the east, moving fast. 3 horses. Her gut tightened before her mind caught up. Thomas Hargrove rode at the front. Behind him were 2 men she didn't recognize, one thick and bearded, one lean with a deputy's star on his chest. They rode straight past her without stopping, headed for Caleb's property. Clara broke into a run. By the time she crested the hill, they were already in the yard. Thomas was off his horse and standing 10 feet from the porch where Caleb stood with his arms at his sides and his hat on and his face set like granite. I'm telling you for the last time, Turner, Thomas was shouting. She ain't your concern, and I'm telling you she's a guest on my property and you've got no business here. She was promised to me. She ain't a horse, Thomas. She's a woman. She makes her own decisions. Clara reached the edge of the yard, breathing hard. All 4 men turned. Thomas pointed at her. There, ask her. Ask her if she intends to honor our arrangement. The deputy shifted on his horse. Ma'am, Mr. Hargrove has filed a formal complaint. He's claiming breach of a marital contract and unlawful occupation of his cabin. I'm not in his cabin, Clara said. I'm on Mr. Turner's property, at his invitation. She was in my cabin for 6 days, Thomas snapped, using my supplies, sleeping in my bed, going through my personal belongings. You built that cabin for me, Clara said. You stocked it for me. You wrote letters inviting me to come. That's not unlawful occupation. That's accepting an invitation. The deputy scratched his jaw. Ma'am, the law in this territory recognizes a promise of marriage as a binding arrangement, Clara said. I have 14 letters from Mr. Hargrove detailing specific commitments. If anyone has breached a contract, it's the man who wasn't standing on that platform when the train arrived. Thomas's face went purple. I was ill. You were afraid. You said so yourself. You told me to my face you didn't know if you wanted a wife or the idea of one. Those were your words, Mr. Hargrove, spoken in front of a witness. Every eye turned to Caleb. Caleb didn't hesitate. She's telling the truth. I was there. He said it. Thomas's hand dropped to his side. He looked at Caleb with something beyond anger, something like betrayal. You were my neighbor, Thomas said. My friend. I am your neighbor. I was never your friend. A friend tells the truth, Thomas. You don't know how. The bearded man on the horse leaned forward. This is getting out of hand. Thomas, let's go. I'm not leaving until she what? Clara stepped forward. She was trembling, but her voice was iron. Until I do what you want? Until I sit in your cabin and pretend those letters were honest? Until I smile and cook and sew and never mention that you practiced your courtship on paper like a schoolboy rehearsing a speech? You had no right to read those drafts. You had no right to lie to me. The silence hit like a thunderclap. Even the horses went still. Clara's chest was heaving. Her hands were clenched at her sides. Her eyes burned, but the tears didn't fall, because she'd used up her tears a week ago, and she had nothing left but fury. I came here because I believed you, she said. Her voice dropped low. I gave up my job. my room, my life. I sat on a train for 4 days, reading your letters over and over, memorizing every word, because I thought a man who could write like that must have a heart worth trusting. And when I got off that train and you weren't there, I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I stood on that platform and I waited. Because that's what a woman does when she believes a man's word. She took another step forward. Thomas took one back. But you didn't come. And now you want to punish me for seeing the truth? For refusing to pretend? For choosing honesty over a comfortable lie? Thomas's lip quivered. His eyes were wet. You embarrassed me, he whispered. No, Thomas. You embarrassed yourself. I just watched. The deputy cleared his throat. I think we're done here. Thomas didn't move. Thomas, the bearded man said, let's go. Thomas looked at Clara one more time, then at Caleb, then at the cabin behind them, a cabin that wasn't his, on land that wasn't his, with a woman inside it who would never be his. You'll regret this, he said. Maybe, Clara said, but I'll regret it on my own terms. Thomas mounted his horse. The bearded man followed. The deputy tipped his hat to Clara, the first respectful gesture she'd received from any man in this town other than Caleb. Ma'am, the deputy said, for what it's worth, I don't think there's a legal case here. There isn't, Clara said. They rode off. Dust settled. Clara stood in the yard with her fists still clenched, and her lungs burning, and her whole body vibrating like a bell that had just been struck. Caleb walked down the porch steps. He stopped 2 feet from her. You all right? He asked quietly. No. What do you need? I need to sit down. He gestured toward the porch. She walked past him and sat on the top step and put her face in her hands and breathed. Caleb sat beside her, not touching, close. You were something else just now, he said after a while. I was terrified. Couldn't tell. Liar. Maybe a little. Your left hand was shaking. Clara lifted her left hand and looked at it, still trembling. My mother's hand used to shake like that, Caleb said. Every time she stood up to my father. Every single time. She'd say her piece, clear as day, steady as stone, and then afterward her hands would shake for an hour. Did it stop? The shaking? The standing up? Caleb shook his head. No, she never stopped. Even when it cost her. Clara lowered her hand into her lap. What did it cost her? Everything except her dignity. Clara closed her eyes. She leaned forward with her elbows on her knees and let the weight of the last 2 weeks press down on her like a physical thing. Every humiliation, every whispered word, every cruel glance, every practiced letter, every empty platform promise, all of it sitting on her shoulders like bags of grain. Caleb, she said without opening her eyes. Yeah? I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. Always. She opened her eyes and turned to look at him. Do you feel sorry for me? No. Are you helping me out of pity? No. Then what? Caleb looked at her. He didn't rush the answer. He sat with it the way he sat with everything, carefully, honestly, like a man who understood the weight of words. I'm helping you because you're the strongest person I've met in 10 years, and you don't even know it yet. And I'm sitting on this porch because there ain't anywhere else I'd rather be. Clara felt the last wall inside her chest crack down the middle. That's a lot of words for you, she whispered. Must be important then. She reached over and laid her hand on his, just rested it there, light as paper. His hand was rough and warm and steady, and he didn't move it, Didn't grip, didn't pull. Just let her touch him, the way a man lets a wild thing come close. Perfectly still, barely breathing. Terrified and grateful in equal measure. They sat like that until the sun touched the ridge. Then Clara pulled her hand back and stood up and smoothed her skirt and tucked her hair behind her ear. "I picked up thread in town," she said, "and Ruth Dawson gave me blackberry preserves." "Ruth Dawson? From the livery. I know Ruth. Good woman. She said the same about you." Caleb stood. He picked up his hat from the step and held it. "Clara." "Yes?" "If Thomas comes back, and he will, you don't have to face him alone." "I know." "But if you want to, I'll stand behind you. Not in front. Behind." Clara looked at him standing there in the last of the daylight, with his hat in his hand, and his scar showing, and his eyes steady, and his whole body turned toward her like a compass needle pointing north. "Behind is good," she said. Caleb put his hat on. "I'll fix that window tomorrow," he said. "The real way. Glass." "Where are you going to get glass?" "I'll figure it out." He stepped off the porch and walked toward the barn, and Clara watched him go and stood there long after he disappeared inside, pressing her hand against her chest, where the crack was widening into something that felt dangerously close to hope. She went inside and set the preserves on the table, and picked up her mending, and sat down and threaded the needle with Ruth Dawson's white thread, and sewed 3 stitches before she stopped. She set the needle down. She pressed both hands flat on the table. "Oh no," she said out loud to the empty room, because Clara Whitmore had survived abandonment, humiliation, public cruelty, and the loss of every plan she'd ever made. She'd fought Thomas Hargrove and Bill Carver and the whole whispering judgment of Copper Bluff, Montana. But she was not prepared for this. She was not prepared for Caleb Turner. And she was not prepared for what her own heart was doing every time he said her name. Clara avoided Caleb for 2 days after that. Not physically. They lived on the same property, ate at the same table, passed each other in the yard and the kitchen, and the narrow hallway between the spare room and the back door. But she stopped looking at him directly. She answered his questions with short words. She kept her hands in her lap at meals, and didn't let them wander across the table toward his. Caleb noticed. Of course he noticed. He was the most observant man she'd ever met. But he didn't push. He gave her the space the way he gave her everything. Quietly, without asking for anything back. On the 3rd morning, Clara was hauling water from the well when her foot caught a loose stone, and the bucket swung hard, and the water slashed across her dress, and she dropped the whole thing and said a word her mother would have slapped her for. Caleb appeared from nowhere. "You all right?" "I'm fine." "You're soaked." "I said I'm fine, Caleb." He picked up the bucket and lowered it back into the well without a word. She stood there, dripping and furious. Not at him, not at the bucket, but at herself for the way her pulse jumped every time he came within 5 feet of her. "You've been quiet," he said, pulling the rope hand over hand. "I've been thinking." "About Thomas?" "About me." He set the full bucket on the stone ledge and straightened. "What about you?" Clara wrung water from her sleeve. "I came to Montana to marry a man. That didn't work. So now I'm living on another man's property, eating his food, sleeping under his roof, and I have $3 to my name and no plan. That bother you?" "It terrifies me." "Which part?" "The part where I'm depending on someone again. The part where I'm doing exactly what I promised myself I wouldn't do." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "You think I'm Thomas?" "No, that's the problem. I know you're not Thomas. If you were, this would be easy. I'd pack my trunk and leave and not look back. But you're not him. You're nothing like him, and that makes this harder. Why? Clara pressed her wet hands against her face and held them there. Because I like being here. I like this kitchen and this well and this stupid heavy bucket. I like Ruth Dawson bringing preserves. I like that you knock before entering a room. I like that you don't fill silence with noise. And I'm afraid that liking all of that is going to trap me just as surely as Thomas's letters would have. Caleb leaned against the well frame and crossed his arms. Clara, look at me. She lowered her hands. You can leave any time, he said. Right now if you want. I'll drive you to the station, buy your ticket, and carry your trunk to the platform. You don't owe me a meal, a word, or a reason. You understand? I understand. Do you want to leave? The answer was in her throat before she could stop it. No. Then stay, and stop punishing yourself for wanting something good. Clara picked up the bucket. The water was heavy, but she carried it herself, and Caleb walked beside her without offering to take it, and that, she thought, was the whole difference between him and every other man she'd ever known. He didn't take things from her hands. He walked beside her while she carried them. Ruth Dawson came by that afternoon on a mule. She brought eggs, a jar of pickled beets, and news. Thomas is leaving, Ruth said. Clara set down the knife she'd been using to peel potatoes. What do you mean, leaving? Selling his land? Harold Griggs at the bank told my husband this morning. Thomas put in the paperwork 2 days ago. Selling. Clara looked at Caleb, who was standing in the doorway. His face gave nothing away. Who's buying? Caleb asked. That's the other thing, Ruth said. She sat down at the kitchen table and folded her hands. He's selling to Emmett Sloan. Caleb's jaw tightened. Clara had never seen that reaction before. Not anger, not frustration, but something closer to dread. Who is Emmett Sloan? Clara asked. Cattle baron from Helena, Caleb said. His voice was flat. Owns about 12,000 acres across the territory. Buys up small ranches, consolidates them, runs the original owners off, or hires them at wages that make starvation look generous. He's been trying to buy into this valley for 3 years, Ruth added. Nobody sold to him. Until now. Clara looked at Caleb. Your land borders Thomas's. Yes. If Sloan owns Thomas's property, he'll be your neighbor. Yes. And he'll want your land too. Caleb didn't answer. He didn't have to. Ruth leaned forward. Caleb, you need to talk to the other ranchers. Bill Meacham, the Petersons, old Hank Cobb. If Sloan gets a foothold in this valley, none of you are safe. Bill Meacham won't talk to me, not since Clara moved in. Then Clara should talk to him. Both of them turned to Ruth. Bill's wife, Margaret, has been sick. No one's helping her because Bill's too proud to ask. Clara, if you showed up with soup and an extra pair of hands, Margaret Meacham would be your friend by sundown. And wherever Margaret goes, Bill follows. Clara looked at the potatoes on the table, then at Ruth, then at Caleb. I don't know Margaret Meacham, she said. She doesn't know you either. That's the point. She hasn't heard Thomas's version yet. She's been bedridden for 2 weeks. You get to her before the gossip does, and you've got an ally. Clara dried her hands on her apron. When? Tomorrow. I'll take you. After Ruth left, Caleb sat at the table and stared at his hands for a long time. You don't have to do this, he said. Do what? Help a sick woman? Get involved in my fight. Clara sat across from him. Caleb, I'm already involved. I live here. If Emmett Sloan takes this valley, I lose this roof too. It ain't your roof. It's the only one I've got. He looked up. Something raw flashed across his face. Vulnerability. The kind he never showed. I've been on this land since I was 19, he said. My father died and left it to me, and I've spent 13 years building it into something. Fences, barn, the well, the cattle line. Every board, every nail. If Sloan comes in, he'll offer me a price that sounds fair, and when I refuse, he'll make my life impossible until I sell. Then don't sell. It ain't that simple. It is that simple. You told me I wasn't a runner, neither are you. Caleb's mouth twitched, using my own words against me. Your words were good. I'm borrowing them. He almost smiled. Clara counted it as a victory. The next morning, Ruth arrived early with a mule and a basket. Clara had been up since before dawn, making broth from the chicken Caleb had slaughtered the night before. She packed the broth in a sealed jar, added biscuits she'd baked at midnight, and wrapped everything in a clean cloth. You ready? Ruth asked. No, let's go. The Meacham place was 4 miles north. Margaret Meacham was 46 years old, thin as a fence rail, and propped up in bed with 3 pillows and a cough that sounded like gravel in a tin bucket. Bill Meacham met them at the door, with suspicion written across every line of his face. What do you want? He said to Clara. I brought soup. We don't need charity. It ain't charity, Mr. Meacham. It's soup. Your wife is sick, and I had extra broth. You can take it, or I'll give it to the chickens, but either way, I'm not carrying it back. Bill Meacham stared at her for a solid 5 seconds. Then he stepped aside. Margaret was awake and grateful in the way only a woman who hasn't had another woman's company in 2 weeks can be. She drank the broth, ate half a biscuit, and talked for an hour straight about her garden, her children who'd moved to Denver, and the fox that had been getting into her henhouse. Clara listened. She didn't talk about herself. She didn't mention Thomas or Caleb or any of it. She just sat beside a sick woman's bed and listened and refilled the broth when the cup was empty. When she finally stood to leave, Margaret caught her hand. You're the woman from the station, Margaret said. Clara's stomach tightened. Yes, ma'am. I heard what happened. Bill told me Thomas's version. Margaret squeezed her hand. But I've been married to Bill Meacham for 28 years, and I know the difference between a man's version and the truth. Clara's throat closed. She squeezed back. Come again tomorrow, Margaret said, and bring more of those biscuits. Outside, Bill Meacham was waiting by the gate. He didn't look at Clara directly. He looked at the ground, then the sky, then the gate latch. Sloan's man came by yesterday, he said. Clara stopped. What did he say? Made an offer. Generous. Too generous. Did you take it? Not yet. Don't. Bill finally looked at her. It ain't your business, Miss Whitmore. Your wife is sick, Mr. Meacham. Your land is your livelihood. If you sell to Sloan, where does Margaret go? Denver, to be a burden on children who left for a reason? A boarding house in Helena? She needs her home. She needs her garden and her henhouse and her bed with 3 pillows. Bill's jaw worked. Caleb put you up to this? Caleb doesn't know I'm saying this. He'd probably tell me to mind my own affairs. But I've learned in the last 3 weeks that minding your own affairs is just another way of letting bad men win. Bill Meacham looked at her for a long time. Then he opened the gate for her. Tell Turner I'll talk to him, he said. Sunday, after church. He doesn't go to church. Then tell him to start. Clara rode back to Caleb's property with Ruth and said nothing for the first mile. Then she turned to Ruth and said, I think I just accidentally started a land war. Ruth laughed. Honey, you started that the day you stepped off the train. When Clara told Caleb about Bill Meacham, he sat in the kitchen chair and ran both hands through his hair, something she'd never seen him do. Sunday, he said, after church. I haven't been in a church since my mother's funeral. Then it's been long enough. Caleb looked at her. You're asking me to walk into that church, where every person in town has been whispering about us for 3 weeks? I'm asking you to walk into that church with me. There's a difference. Is there? Yes, because when we walk in together, they'll see exactly what they've been gossiping about, and they'll see that we aren't ashamed. Caleb shook his head slowly. You're something, Clara Whitmore. I'm a shop clerk from St. Louis with $3 and a borrowed roof. I'm not something. I'm desperate. Desperate people don't make soup for strangers. Maybe that's exactly what desperate people do. Sunday came hot and bright. Clara put on the blue dress, the one she'd worn for Thomas. The one Caleb had told her not to waste on a man who didn't notice. She buttoned it to the throat and pinned her hair and stood in front of the mirror. And this time, the woman looking back at her was different. Not thinner, not older, just clearer, like someone had wiped dust off a window. Caleb was waiting by the wagon in a clean shirt she'd never seen before. His boots were polished, his hair was combed. He'd shaved. She stopped on the porch. You shaved, she said. Seemed appropriate. You look different. Better or worse? Different. He offered his hand to help her onto the wagon. She took it. First time she'd accepted that gesture. His palm was warm and calloused, and he held on exactly long enough and let go exactly on time. The ride to church was quiet. Clara's hands were folded tight in her lap. Caleb's grip on the reins was white-knuckled. Nervous? She asked. I don't get nervous. Your hands say otherwise. He loosened his grip deliberately. I don't like being watched. Then you picked the wrong woman to help. I didn't pick you, Clara. You showed up. And you stayed. I stayed. The church was small and packed. Every pew was full. When Clara and Caleb walked through that door together, the murmuring stopped like someone had blown out a candle. Every face turned. Clara felt every eye like a physical weight. The woman in the blue bonnet. Bill Carver and his wife. The preacher behind the pulpit. Ranchers and their families. Children craning their necks. And in the third pew from the front, Thomas Hargrove. He turned and saw them, and his face went white. Clara didn't slow down. She walked straight down the center aisle with Caleb half a step behind her, and she chose a pew on the opposite side from Thomas. And she sat down and folded her hands and looked straight ahead. Caleb sat beside her. Their shoulders touched. The preacher recovered first. He cleared his throat and opened his Bible and began the service. But Clara could feel the energy in that room like heat from a stove. Every whisper was about them. Every sideways glance. Every nudge. Let them look. The sermon was about forgiveness. Clara thought that was either perfect timing or God's idea of a joke. After the service, people filed out slowly. Clara stood and waited for the aisle to clear. Thomas was ahead of them. He walked past without looking at her. Outside, the congregation milled about in small groups. Clara felt the invisible wall around her. People keeping their distance, pretending to be engaged in other conversations. Then Bill Meacham walked over. He shook Caleb's hand, firmly, publicly, in front of everyone. Turner, he said, my wife says you've got a good woman there. I'm inclined to agree. The silence around them was deafening. Caleb shook his hand. Appreciate that, Bill. About Sloan. I'll hold my land if you hold yours. I ain't going anywhere. Then neither am I. Old Hank Cobb was next, 70 years old, bent like a question mark, sharp as a tack. He hobbled over and looked Clara up and down. You the one who told Thomas Hargrove to his face that he was a coward? Clara straightened. I told him he was afraid. There's a difference. Hank Cobb cackled. There ain't. He turned to Caleb. I like her. She's got grit. Sloan's man came to me too. I told him where he could put his offer. I'll stand with you. One by one they came. Not all of them, not even most, but enough. The Petersons, Ruth's husband from the livery, a quiet man named Virgil who ran the grain mill. They shook Caleb's hand and nodded at Clara and said small things that meant everything. Thomas watched from across the churchyard. He stood alone near his horse, with his hands in his pockets and his jaw clenched. And Clara saw something on his face she hadn't expected. Not anger. Regret. Real, bone-deep, irreversible regret. He'd had a woman willing to cross 2,000 miles for him, and he'd thrown her away because he was too small to deserve her. And now he was watching her stand beside a man who understood what he never could. That Clara Whitmore wasn't someone you possessed. She was someone you stood beside. Thomas mounted his horse and rode out of town without speaking to anyone. Clara watched him go. She felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not pity. Just the clean, empty feeling of a chapter closing. On the ride home, Caleb was quiet for a long time. Then he pulled the wagon to a stop in the middle of the road. Clara looked at him. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong." He set the reins down. He turned to face her fully. "Clara, I need to say something, and I'm going to say it plain because that's the only way I know how." Her heart started hammering. "All right?" "I've been alone on that land for 13 years. I told myself it was enough. Told myself I didn't need anyone, didn't deserve anyone, that the war took whatever part of me a woman might want. And I believed that. Right up until you stepped off that train and stood on that platform like you were daring the whole world to knock you down." Clara couldn't breathe. "I'm not asking you for anything," he said. "I'm not Thomas. I'm not going to write you letters full of promises I can't keep. But I need you to know that every morning I wake up and come to that kitchen and see you sitting at that table, I'm grateful. And if you leave tomorrow, or next week, or next year, I will never regret a single day you were here." Clara's eyes blurred. She blinked hard, and the tears fell anyway. "You idiot," she whispered. Caleb blinked. "What?" "You absolute idiot. You think I stayed because I had nowhere to go? You think I made soup for Margaret Meacham and argued with Bill Carver and put on this dress and walked into that church because I'm desperate? I stayed because of you. Because you knock before entering rooms. Because you carry firewood at dawn. Because you never once told me what to do or who to be. Because when I asked you a question, you answered honestly, every time, even when the truth was hard." Caleb's hands were trembling on the reins. Clara had never seen his hands shake. Not once. Not when Thomas came with a deputy. Not when the stone came through the window. Not once. They were shaking now. "I ain't good at this," he said. "Good at what?" "Saying things. Feeling things. Letting someone close enough to... To what?" "To matter." Clara reached over and took both his hands. "One more word about not deserving this. One more word about not deserving this. I'll hit you with that bucket." Caleb laughed. An actual laugh. The first she'd ever heard from him. It was rough and unpracticed, and it broke something open in his chest that had been sealed shut for 13 years. "Fair enough," he said. Clara didn't let go of his hands. He didn't pull away. They sat in that wagon in the middle of a dirt road with the summer heat pressing down on them, and their fingers intertwined, and their hearts doing things that neither of them had words for. "Caleb," she said. "Yeah?" "Take me home." He picked up the reins. She stayed close. Their shoulders pressed together, and this time neither of them pretended it was the wagon's doing. The road stretched west toward his land, and the dust rose behind them. And Clara Whitmore sat beside Caleb Turner and felt, for the first time in her life, like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because a letter promised it, not because a man arranged it, because she chose it. Emmett Sloan arrived in Copper Bluff on a Tuesday. Clara heard about it from Ruth, who heard it from her husband, who saw the man step off a private coach with two men in suits and a leather case full of documents. He didn't go to the saloon. He didn't go to the general store. He went straight to the land registry office and stayed for 2 hours. By Wednesday, every rancher in the valley knew his name. By Thursday, they knew his offer. Caleb was mending a fence line when Clara brought him the news. She walked across the field carrying water, and the words Ruth had told her, and she said them straight, because Caleb didn't need softening. Sloan is offering $3 an acre, cash, to every rancher bordering Thomas's land. Caleb drove the fence post deeper with one swing. $3 is double what this land appraised for last year. I know. Half the valley will take it. Bill Meacham won't. He told Ruth this morning. Bill Meacham has a sick wife and no sons to help him work. $3 an acre would pay for a doctor in Helena and a house in town where Margaret could rest. Clara set the water pail down. Are you saying he should sell? Caleb pulled the post straight and tested it. I'm saying I wouldn't blame him. Would you sell? He stopped working, stood up, looked at her with those steady eyes that never lied and never flinched and never looked away first. No. Even if he makes it impossible? Especially then. Clara nodded. Then we fight. We. Caleb said the word like he was tasting it. When did this become we? About the same time you stopped calling me ma'am. He almost smiled. She counted it. That evening, Caleb rode out to visit Bill Meacham, the Petersons, and old Hank Cobb. Clara stayed at the house and did something she'd never done before. She sat at Caleb's desk, a rough plank table he used for accounts, and she wrote a letter. Not to Thomas, not to St. Louis, not to anyone from her old life. She wrote to the territorial governor's office in Helena. She wrote 4 pages in the careful, precise handwriting of a woman who'd spent 3 years clerking in a stationery shop and knew the power of words on paper. She detailed Emmett Sloan's acquisition pattern across Montana territory. She cited 3 previous valleys where he'd bought out small ranchers and consolidated their land into holdings that employed fewer men at lower wages and produced less for the local economy. She'd gotten the details from Ruth, who'd gotten them from the livery customers, who talked more freely than they realized when their horses were being shod. She sealed the letter and set it on the table and waited for Caleb. He came back after dark. He sat down heavily and pulled off his boots and rubbed his face with both hands. Hank's holding, he said. Peterson's are shaky. Bill's torn. I wrote a letter. He looked up. To who? The governor's office, about Sloan's land consolidation. Caleb stared at her. You wrote to the governor? To his office, to the Territorial Land Commission specifically. Sloan's purchases across Montana might violate the Homestead Act provisions about land accumulation in territorial holdings. If there's a legal challenge to be made, it starts with documentation. Caleb picked up the letter and read it. His eyes moved slowly across every line. When he finished, he set it down and looked at her the way a man looks at a sunrise he didn't expect to see. Where did you learn to write like this? 3 years in a stationery shop?
I wrote correspondence for half the businessmen in St.
Louis, who couldn't compose a sentence past "Dear Sir." This is good, Clara. It might not work. It might not, but it's the smartest thing anyone in this valley has done since Sloan showed up. Clara took the letter back. I'll mail it tomorrow, but I need you to do something. Name it. Talk to the deputy, the one who came with Thomas. He seemed reasonable. If there's any legal standing to challenge Sloan's purchases, the deputy will know who to contact in the territorial courts. Caleb nodded slowly. You've been thinking about this. I've been thinking about this since Ruth told me Thomas was selling. That was 2 weeks ago. I'm a planner, Caleb. That's what I do. In St. Louis, I planned inventory, supply orders, customer accounts. I solved problems on paper before they became problems in person. And now you're solving this. I'm trying. Is that all right with you? Caleb leaned back in his chair. Clara, I spent 13 years solving every problem on this ranch by myself. Every broken fence, every sick cow, every dry well, every bad winter. Alone. Because I believed that's what a man does. And now? Now there's a woman at my desk writing letters to the governor, and I'm sitting here realizing that alone wasn't strength. It was stubbornness. Clara felt the warmth spread through her chest. She held it there and let it settle. We're both stubborn, she said. That's what worries me. It shouldn't. Two stubborn people pulling in the same direction can move a mountain. Or tear each other apart. We won't. How do you know? Because you knock before entering rooms, and I always answer. Caleb held her gaze for a long time. Then he stood, crossed the room, and did something he'd never done. He cupped her face in both hands, rough, calloused, gentle, and pressed his forehead against hers. They stood like that, breathing the same air, not kissing, not speaking, just touching in the most honest way two people can touch. Forehead to forehead. Heart to heart. I'm scared, he whispered. Of Sloan? Of losing this. Whatever this is. I've never had anything I was afraid to lose. Clara closed her eyes. Then we don't lose it. He pulled back. His hands dropped to his sides. He cleared his throat and looked at the floor, the way men do when their emotions outrun their words. I'll talk to the deputy tomorrow, he said. Good. And Clara? Yes? That letter is better than anything Thomas Hargrove ever wrote. And he practiced. Clara laughed, a full, real laugh that filled the kitchen and bounced off the walls, and sounded like something that belonged in this house. The letter went out the next morning. Caleb rode to town to see the deputy. Clara went to check on Margaret Meacham. Margaret was sitting up in bed for the first time in 3 weeks, color in her cheeks, biscuit crumbs on her quilt. She grabbed Clara's hand the moment she walked in. Bill told me about Sloan's offer, Margaret said. I know. He wants to take it. Clara sat down. Do you? Margaret's grip tightened. This house has 4 graves behind it. My mother-in-law. 2 babies I lost before they took their first breath. And Bill's brother who died of cholera in '74. You don't sell land that holds your dead. Clara felt the weight of those words settle into her bones. Then tell Bill that, she said. I have. He says sentiment doesn't pay for medicine. He's right. But selling to Sloan won't save this valley. It'll end it. Every small ranch gone. Every family scattered. Every grave forgotten under someone else's cattle. Margaret's eyes filled. You sound like you've been here 20 years, not 20 days. Some places grab you fast. Or some people do. Clara didn't answer that. She squeezed Margaret's hand and stood. I wrote to the governor's office, Clara said, about Sloan. There may be legal grounds to challenge his acquisitions. Legal grounds, Margaret almost smiled.
A mail-order bride fighting a cattle baron with a letter. If that ain't the most American thing I've ever heard. I wasn't a mail-order bride. I was a woman who answered an advertisement. What's the difference? A mail-order bride waits to be claimed. I came to do the claiming. Margaret Meacham laughed so hard she started coughing, and Clara held her shoulders until she stopped. And when she looked up, Bill was standing in the doorway with red eyes and a face that had given up pretending he wasn't listening. "I'll hold the land," Bill said quietly. "God help me, but I'll hold it." Clara nodded. "Good. But if your letter doesn't work, then we find another way, and another after that." Bill Meacham looked at her for a long time. Then he said something that hit Clara harder than anything Thomas Hargrove ever wrote in 14 letters. "Caleb Turner is a lucky man," he said, "whether he knows it or not." "He knows it," Clara said. "He just doesn't say it out loud." "He will. Give him time." Clara walked back to Caleb's property alone. The walk was 90 minutes, and she used every one of them to think. About the letter. About Sloan. About Margaret's graves, and Bill's pride, and Ruth's loyalty. And the way this valley full of stubborn, suspicious, hard-working people had started to crack open just enough to let her inside. She was a quarter-mile from the house when she saw the horse tied to the porch rail. Not Caleb's horse. A tall black mare she didn't recognize. Clara slowed. Her stomach tightened. She came around the side of the house carefully and heard voices through the open kitchen window. "Offer stands, Mr. Turner. $3.50 an acre. That's more than generous." "I heard you the first time. Then you understand the mathematics. Your land, plus Hargrove's, gives us a contiguous 1,200-acre parcel. We'd bring in 300 head by spring. Employment for— I ain't interested in your employment. I've got my own cattle, my own land, and my own reasons for keeping both." "Reasons can change, Mr. Turner. Mine don't." Clara walked through the front door. 2 men were sitting at her kitchen table. Caleb and a man she'd never seen. 50-ish, silver-haired, well-dressed in a way that looked wrong in a ranch kitchen. His hands were too clean. His boots had never seen mud. Emmett Sloan. He looked at Clara. His eyes did a quick calculation. Who she was, what she meant, how she could be used. "You must be Miss Whitmore," he said. "I've heard a great deal about you." "I've heard about you too, Mr. Sloan. None of it good." Sloan's smile didn't waver. "I imagine Thomas Hargrove has a biased perspective." "Thomas Hargrove is the least of your problems." "I've written to the Territorial Land Commission about your acquisition pattern in Montana. Specifically, about the Homestead Act provisions regarding single-entity accumulation in territorial holdings." The smile died. "I've documented your purchases in the Gallatin Valley, the Bitterroot, and the Judith Basin," Clara continued. 3 valleys, 14 ranches, total consolidation within 2 years of initial purchase. The Commission takes a dim view of land monopolization in territories seeking statehood. Sloan stood slowly. "Miss Whitmore, you don't know what you're dealing with." "I'm dealing with a man who buys other people's lives and calls it business. I've dealt with men like you before, Mr. Sloan. They were just smaller. This isn't St. Louis. No, in St. Louis, men like you wear better suits. Out here, you just have more horses." Caleb's mouth twitched, but he stayed silent. This was Clara's fight, and he knew it. Sloan picked up his hat. "The offer expires at the end of the month, Mr. Turner. After that, I have other methods of acquisition." "Such as?" Clara asked. "Water rights, grazing access, supply routes. A ranch is only as strong as its connections. Cut those connections and you'll find out exactly how many neighbors Mr. Turner has who've decided to cut their connections with you instead." Sloan looked at her. Really looked. And for the first time, Clara saw something in his eyes that she recognized from every bully she'd ever faced. The flicker of uncertainty that comes when a man realizes he's underestimated his opponent. "Good day, Miss Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Turner." He walked out. The black mare carried him down the road, and Clara watched from the window until he was gone. Then her knees buckled. Caleb caught her. His arms went around her waist, and he held her up, and she pressed her face against his chest and shook. "I can't believe I just did that," she said into his shirt. "I can." "He's going to retaliate." "Probably." "I don't care." "I know you don't. That's what makes you dangerous." Clara pulled back and looked at him. His arms were still around her waist. She hadn't asked him to let go, and he hadn't offered to. "Caleb." "Yeah." "This is the part where you kiss me." "Is it?" "Yes." "I've never been good at timing." "Your timing is fine. Your courage needs work." He kissed her. It wasn't gentle, and it wasn't rough, and it wasn't anything like the romances she'd read on the train from St. Louis. It was honest. That was the word. The only word. Honest the way everything Caleb Turner did was honest. His hands on her back, firm and sure. His mouth against hers, warm and unhurried. The sound he made in the back of his throat that was half relief and half surrender. When he pulled back, his eyes were wet. "I've been wanting to do that since you told Bill Carver to say it to your face," he said. "That long?" "That long. You should have done it sooner. You would have hit me with the bucket." "Maybe, but I would have kissed you back." He laughed, that rough, unpracticed laugh she was learning to love. She reached up and touched the scar on his neck, the thin, white line from Spotsylvania, and traced it with her fingertip. "Does it hurt?" she asked. "Not anymore." "When did it stop?" "About 30 seconds ago." Clara pressed her palm flat against his chest. His heart was hammering. This man who'd survived the war, survived grief, survived 13 years of solitude. His heart was pounding like a boy's at his first dance. "I'm staying," she said. "I know. Not because I have nowhere else. Because I choose this. I choose you." "Clara, don't argue. For once in your life, just accept something good without questioning whether you deserve it." He pressed his forehead against hers again. That gesture that had become theirs, the most intimate thing two people can do while still standing. "I accept it," he whispered. The letter to the governor's office received a response 3 weeks later. The Territorial Land Commission opened an inquiry into Emmett Sloan's acquisition practices across Montana Territory. A representative would be sent to Copper Bluff to interview affected ranchers and review land records. When the news spread, Sloan pulled his offers, every single one. He didn't leave Montana. Men like Sloan never fully disappeared. But he pulled out of the valley like a wolf retreating from a fire, and the ranchers who'd been wavering, the Petersons, the families farther north, stopped wavering. Bill Meacham told Caleb the news at the feed store, and Caleb came home and found Clara in the garden she'd planted behind the house. She was kneeling in the dirt with her sleeves rolled up and soil under her nails and sweat on her forehead, and he stood there and watched her for a full minute before she looked up. "What?" she said. Sloan pulled his offers. Clara sat back on her heels. She closed her eyes and let the breath leave her body in one long, slow exhale. "All of them?" "All of them." She opened her eyes. The letter worked. You worked. The letter was just paper. Clara stood and wiped her hands on her apron. She walked to him, and he put his arms around her, and they stood in the garden together and held each other, and neither one of them said a word, because the words had already been said, and the work had already been done, and some moments are too full for language. That night, Caleb asked her a question. They were sitting on the porch, side by side, shoulders touching. The kind of quiet that comes after a storm passes and the air is clean and everything feels possible. Clara? Yes? I ain't gonna ask you to marry me. She looked at him. You're not? No, because you didn't come to Montana to be asked. You came to choose. So I'm going to tell you what I want, and then you're going to decide.
Clara's heart was beating so hard she could feel it in her teeth. I want you here, Caleb said. Not because you were left. Not because you had nowhere else. Not because of Thomas, or the town, or Sloan, or any of it. I want you here because you made this house a home, and you made this land worth fighting for, and you made me believe that a man who thought he was finished could start again. He paused. If you want to marry me, I'll walk into that church tomorrow and stand in front of every person who whispered about us and say your name out loud. And if you don't want to marry me, you can stay anyway, as long as you want. No conditions, no debt, no obligation. Because you're the best thing that's ever happened to me, and I'd rather have you here on your terms than lose you trying to set mine. Clara pressed her hand against her mouth. She held it there for 5 seconds. 10. Then she lowered it. Caleb Turner, she said. I've been proposed to by a man who practiced his words in draft letters and couldn't deliver a single honest sentence. And now I'm being proposed to by a man who can barely string 10 words together, and every single one of them is true. Is that a yes? That's a yes. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out something small. A ring. Simple. Thin gold band, slightly bent, rubbed smooth by years. It was my mother's, he said. She told me to give it to someone worth standing up for. Clara held out her left hand. It was trembling. He slid the ring on, and it fit perfectly, and she laughed through her tears because, of course it did. She sounds like she was something, Clara said. She was everything, just like you. They were married on a Saturday in the same church where they'd walked down the aisle together 3 weeks earlier. Ruth Dawson stood beside Clara. Bill Meacham stood beside Caleb. Old Hank Cobb sat in the back and blew his nose. Old Hank Cobb sat in the back and blew his nose so loud the preacher had to pause. The whole town came, even Bill Carver, who stood at the back with his hat in his hands and didn't meet Clara's eyes, but showed up, which was its own kind of apology. Thomas Hargrove did not come. He'd sold his land and left for Oregon 2 weeks prior. No farewell, no letter, no closure. Clara didn't need his closure. She had her own. After the ceremony, Caleb drove her home in the wagon, the same wagon that had carried her from the station to Thomas's cabin, from Thomas's cabin to Caleb's house, from fear to safety to love. She sat close beside him, their shoulders pressed together. The ring caught the late afternoon light and threw a small, bright fleck against the dashboard. "Caleb," she said. "Yeah?" "Thank you for coming to the station that day." "I almost didn't." She turned sharply. "What?" "Thomas asked me the night before. I said no. Told him it wasn't my business. Then I laid awake all night thinking about a woman standing on a platform alone, and I couldn't live with it. You almost didn't come. But I did." Clara shook her head slowly. "One decision, one single decision, and everything changed. That's how it works, every time." She leaned into him and closed her eyes,
and listened to the wagon wheels and the horses' hooves and the steady rhythm of Caleb Turner's heartbeat through his shirt. 3 months later, Clara stood on the platform at Copper Bluff Station, not waiting, not abandoned, not searching for a brown hat. She was picking up a shipment of fabric she'd ordered from St. Louis, calico and muslin for a quilting circle Ruth Dawson had organized, and Clara had been roped into teaching because, as Ruth put it, "You've got the steadiest hands in the county and the most stubborn streak, and both are useful for quilting."
The train pulled in, steam rolled across the platform. The porter unloaded her crate and tipped his hat. "Mrs. Turner?" "That's me." She signed for the shipment and lifted the crate herself and carried it to the wagon where Caleb was waiting. He took it from her and set it in the bed and helped her up onto the bench and held her hand 1 second longer than necessary before picking up the reins. "Got everything?" he asked. "Everything." He drove the wagon down the main street, past the general store where Bill Carver nodded from the doorway, past the livery where Ruth waved, past the church where the preacher tipped his hat, past the edges of town and onto the road that led west to the land they'd fought for, and the home they'd built, and the life they'd chosen. Clara looked over her shoulder one last time at the station platform, the same platform where she'd stood with a cracked letter and $3 and the name no one had come to claim. She turned forward. She didn't need to look back. Clara Whitmore had not come west to be chosen. She had come west to choose. And she chose the man beside her, the land beneath her, and the life ahead of her. Not because it was promised, not because it was perfect, but because it was hers. Every board, every nail, every word, hers.